Hi. We move into 1 Samuel 14 today in our ongoing examination of the story from 1 Samuel 11 to 15 of the fall of Saul, which will then be followed by the rise of David very soon. And in the interim here, now that Samuel is out of the picture as Saul's harasser, surprisingly, his counterpart will be his own son Jonathan, who we'll soon see will betray his father and side with David and then give his whole heart to David in the coming chapters. But as the story starts here at the beginning of 14, we have no reason to suspect that. So let's look at just the last couple of verses we saw at the end of the last video in chapter 13 to note the context in the narrative before we begin chapter 14, which begins as if it's a set piece in a wholly different context. So at the end of chapter 13, the narrator had noted that the Philistines controlled the sharpening of tools and access to swords and spears. So we see here, although they're mustered for battle with 10,000 soldiers, here on the day of the battle neither sword nor spear was to be found in the possession of any of the people with Saul and Jonathan, but Saul and his son Jonathan had them. So note what's happening there. Saul and Jonathan are being isolated from the rest of the people as the only ones who have sword and spear, and their names are mentioned twice together in that verse. But as soon as we get to the beginning of chapter 14, one day Jonathan, son of Saul, said, and Jonathan's acting on his own. So let's move down to the beginning of our chapter here, and we'll look at this story. And as we do, we're continuing to follow these scenes and themes, and we're going to look today at this scene, 14:1 to 15, as Jonathan takes on the Philistines, and next time we'll look at Saul's response. Let's look a little closer at this particular scene, which I've divided into 4 parts here. There's nothing formal about the structure, just a way to have us engage this section. So the first verse is simply the invitation of Jonathan to his partner there, described regularly as armor bearer, but we'll come to look at that's maybe a misleading translation in just a moment. Then there's a little aside about the fact that Saul is not there, literally sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah, and doesn't know anything about what's going on here. So right away, before anything happens, we have a very strange scene where the king's son goes off all by himself with only his assistant to take on the dreaded Philistines without even telling his father or trying to gather any more troops. And then in 14:4 to 10, we see the proposal, the plan that Jonathan presents as what they're going to do. And then we see the outcome, and the outcome of is it that the two of them kill 20 Philistines and create a great panic in the Philistine camp. So it's quite a scene, and in many ways we ought to read this, I think, as a parody, because we try to take seriously the idea that this one young man, whose age we don't know, nor do we have any reason to think he has experience, except for one earlier scene in chapter 13 that we looked at, and I'll come back to in a moment. But the idea that the son of the king would go off without even telling his father and engage in this battle is absurd at every level. And the idea that he could beat the Philistines and kill 20 of them without getting a scratch is also absurd. But that's part of the point here. Will be the contrast between what Jonathan does in this scene and Saul's response in the next scene, which we'll get at in the next video. We're getting Jonathan for the first time as a character to actually doing something. First time he's speaking, for sure. He was mentioned at the beginning of chapter 13 as having 1,000 of the troops. So Saul chose 3,000, and he kept 2,000 and gave 1,000 to his son. And then in the next verse, we are told, and I noted at the time that defeated is misleading here, Jonathan struck the garrison of the Philistines. So he attacked them for sure. The fact that the New RSV says defeated is certainly overstating that, because the issue is he's, as I titled the video at the time, poking the Philistine bear. So we don't know how extensive the strike was, and so defeat overstates that. So he had whatever experience that was of battling the Philistines. And then we have the scene we're at here. But after this scene, and after Saul's response to it, we'll have the infamous honey incident that takes up the rest of chapter 14, where Saul rashly, as the narrator says, prohibits anybody from eating until they win, and Jonathan, having not heard it, freshens himself with some honey and ends up in a confrontation with his father. And after that, a few chapters go by while Saul continues to go down, and David makes his appearance and rises. And once David has defeated Goliath, Jonathan and David make the first expression of the covenant, first of 3 expressions of a covenant between them, in this case based on love, and then later siding with David against his father as he begins to see that his father is losing it, and then they openly conspire against him in secret, and then finally make a covenant where Jonathan predicts that David will be the next king. And at the end of the book of 1 Samuel, Jonathan is killed by the Philistines. So he won't make it into the reign of his beloved friend David. But he sits in this story as a bridge in Saul's reign between Samuel, the prophet who castigates Saul every which direction, as we've seen, and David, who will be working for Saul and will save him from, and the Israelites from, embarrassment by defeating Goliath and winning a number of battles, but ultimately is the thorn in Saul's side that will eventually bring him down. So that all starts with this scene here. So there aren't a lot of detailed words or symbolism, so we'll be able to go through 15 verses here relatively quickly, although there are obviously, as usual, some things to point out. For example, in this scene section, you'll notice I've color-coded certain words that are key words here. I've got the Hebrew in there, and we'll go at that more closely. The word for armor, as I note here, can mean utensils or anything somebody carries, so it's overstating it to say he's the armor bearer. Really, he's simply his assistant, like a Sherpa, someone simply carrying his possessions that they need for their adventure out here to take on the Philistines. We also see the word garrison, which is a different word than in chapter 13, where we saw a different word for garrison. That word could have meant the person itself. Here, this literally refers to like the building or the place where soldiers dwell. But when we see the Philistines' garrison will move, that's suggesting the soldiers obviously not carrying the fort with them. We also see the verb come a number of times, often with come up. Here's the root here. We see how often that is. So the issue is going back and forth between them, and we'll see there's a little play on coming over in verse 11 and verse 14 that we'll see in just a bit. So just a few key words there to get us going as we follow through this story. So the beginning here, literally one day, is it was the day, which is making it more specific and really highlighting this is a new story. So Jonathan, son of Saul, said to the young man who carried his armor, and notice that Jonathan is accompanied by a young man just as Saul was back in chapter 9, and as David will be to Saul. Here's the first of the come, let us go over to the Philistine garrison on the other side. Now, if you're the young man, what might you think of Jonathan, your boss, telling you, let's go by ourselves over to the fort where all these Philistines are? But we don't see any response at that moment. Instead, the narrator breaks in with this little aside about Saul. But the narrator does make a point before we get there that Jonathan explicitly did not tell his father. Why would he not tell his father? At this point, we have no reason to think there's any bad relationship between them. And as I just noted 2 verses before, they were there together with their swords and spears, the only ones who had them. And in his earlier attack on the Philistines, that led Saul to get into motion. So it wasn't over against his father. But there's something funny going on here, and the narrator's plainly not telling us everything. So we see literally that Saul is sitting here, and the outskirts is a little misleading, and it's a play on words we'll see in the honey scene. But Ketza here means in the outskirts or along the tip, the tip of town, and that'll match the tip of Jonathan's staff later in the chapter. And there are several things in this chapter, in the scene, that are oddly specific. It's not clear why other than for verisimilitude, why the writer is providing a number of details that don't seem to be relevant to the story, as we see here. Outskirts of Gibeah is certainly relevant. We've seen the importance of Gibeah. But under the pomegranate tree, why do we need to know it's a Heremon, a pomegranate tree, which is next only in the description of Solomon's decorations of the temple, and only in Deuteronomy and Judges earlier in the entire Deuteronomistic history here when you come into a land filled with fig trees and pomegranates and other things. And the tree is described as at Migron. This may be a place, or as Samora notes, or in the threshing floor, although it's not clear why you'd have a tree in the threshing floor. Maybe for shade, for doing the work of threshing, it's unclear. But all these details, it's not clear why we need to know that. This detail, though, does matter. The troops that were with them are about 600. So this is in contrast with the 10,000 of the Philistines, and makes a head-on confrontation not a good battle strategy. But along with him is something very suspicious in verse 3. Suddenly we get something very suspicious. The surprising return of the family of Eli a couple of generations later. And let's look at a couple of details to see some of this. So he's with Ahijah. The rest is his genealogy, the great-grandson of Eli. And as Falkelman notes in my note below, Ahijah comes from a repudiated family of priests. Is this war to run just as disastrously as the one in chapter 4 and lead to a departure of God's majesty from Israel and make Saul a new Ichabod, which you recall is the meaning of Ichabod, the glory has left. So this is a bad sign that Saul would go to a disgraced priestly family a couple of generations later. Let's look just briefly at the genealogy here to see some other details. Ahijah is described as the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, whose birth was not narrated at the birth of Ichabod, whose mother dies in childbirth. So this birth obviously had to be before Ichabod. It's curious that back in chapter 4, the narrator said nothing about Eli's son having son Phinehas having another son along with Ichabod. But here he is. Notice the son of Phinehas, son of Eli, one of the two sons of Eli that we saw there, named here as priest of the Lord in Shiloh. And for the first time we're seeing here carrying an ephod, first time since 2:18 at least, and the next won't be till chapter 21. It assumes that the audience knows what an ephod is. Ephod is simply the transliteration of the Hebrew here. Some kind of garment that was used for divination in a way that scholars can't quite get back to how that worked. Whether it's supposed to be a magic thing or something else, we just simply don't have enough information to know. So what many scholars have noted here is recalling here Judges 8:27, as Bodder knows. I'll show you this example here. Gideon made an ephod and put it in his town, and bad things happen after that. You can read that story in Judges 8:27 and following yourself. And just as Saul didn't know that Jonathan had gone out against the Philistines, the people also don't know. So when we get to the plan, it's a secret plan from everybody except the two of them. And so when they get to the pass, and we look at a lot of detail in verse 4 and 5, and we'll look at the maps, both my schematic map and Google Maps Live, to see something about this place. So in the pass, by which Jonathan tried to go over the Philistine garrison, clearly trying a strategy that would eliminate the advantage the Philistines have of their iron-wheeled chariots, which presumably can't go up into the high mountains among these craggy passes. So it would have to be man-to-man. There was a rocky crag on one side and a rocky crag on the other. The phrase for rocky crag here, Shen Hasalah, and I've noted crag here several times in the brown. Rock is fine, Shen, but Hasalah, crag, is the whole phrase is only here, and it's crag itself is only one other time where it's described as a hiding place, translated as rock there. I'll show you back in the last chapter. They were hiding themselves in rocks, and it doesn't really make any sense. You could hide yourself in a rock. You could hide, of course, among the rocks, which is probably what's expected to be seen here. That between the two crags, they're hiding, and in a moment we'll see they reveal themselves. And then we get, oddly, the names of the two. Bozez, which means shining one, and Senah, which means thorny one. Why we have those names, who knows? And the narrator adds more detail. One crag rose to the north in front of Mishmash, and the other in the south in front of Geba. So when we look at our schematic map, we go back to this area, and it suggests that it's somewhere right in there. But when we look at Google Maps of the actual area, and I note here that this is one place labeled Mishmash, and Jerusalem is down here. So if we go back to the other map, you'll note that these places seem to be directly north of Jerusalem. But on the Google Maps, Jerusalem's down here, and the places labeled Mishmash or Giza here, right here, are to the east of that. But if we look at Google Maps in its three-dimensional angle here, there don't seem to be any crags in this area at all that I can see. Nothing of any height, just some rolling hills. And even if we zoom in on it to see, and even if we go to this other area closer to Jerusalem, it still looks like just rolling hills. So it seems to be that the crags are an element of the story rather than an element of the actual geography of the area. So having established that now, the narrator frames with verse 1, Jonathan again saying to the young man with him, come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. This is the first time in 1 Samuel we hear uncircumcised, and the next time is David referring to Goliath. It was used a couple times earlier in Judges. But other than this one place in Jeremiah 9:26, the Philistines are the only group named as uncircumcised. Otherwise, just generally everybody else or the uncircumcised nations are referred to, or people within the group of Israel who are not yet circumcised. But so uncircumcised becomes the pejorative label for the Philistines, much like Hebrews is for the Philistines about the Israelites, as we'll see. So they're doing some shit-talking, so to speak, here before this gets started, although not to each other. This is simply Jonathan talking to his assistant. And he says, let's go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that Yahweh or the Lord will act for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or a few. Notice what Jonathan is doing is talking about Yahweh, not talking to Yahweh. And when we look at Saul in the next scene, where he attempts by ephod and other means to get a direct word from Yahweh, scholars are divided on which strategy seems to be more faithful. But Jonathan here is not praying, and we don't know of any actual relationship with Yahweh, nor do we know on what basis he's making this decision that he can assume that Yahweh is acting on their behalf if they do certain things. The phrase here that nothing can hinder Yahweh from saving by many or a few is almost certainly a reference back to the Gideon story in Judges 7:2-7, where Gideon is about to attack and has 10,000 troops and eventually lowers them to 300 so that the credit will go to Yahweh and not to Gideon. Not to say we did this with our own strength, but to highlight the impossibility of winning with so few troops, to highlight it was Yahweh's work. So perhaps that's on Jonathan's mind, but we know nothing about Jonathan's piety at this point, or who he's trying to prove it to at this point in the story, that it's Yahweh at work. His assistant agrees with him in this way of phrasing it: do all that your mind or your heart inclines you. I am with you as your heart is, so is mine. Translated both times, mind is the Hebrew leb for heart. And we'll notice how similar that is to David and Jonathan's relationship, and also to, at the beginning, to David and Saul's relationship. So this sense of being in perfect solidarity together. So now that Jonathan knows that his assistant is with him, we see him strategize this. Now we will cross over to those men and will show ourselves to them. If they say to us, wait until we come to you, then we will stand still and go to our place. If not, and we will not go up to them. But if they say, come up to us, then we will go up, for Yahweh or the Lord has given them into our hand. That will be the sign for us. So he's set this up, and we don't know that Yahweh agrees with this or not, but it will happen as he says. I will note, going back here, I skipped over it here, that Diana Edelman notes below. She sees this strategy calculated to have the remaining guards of the garrison think that the two are deserting Israelites coming out of hiding, who would then be let into the post in order to be questioned about Saul's position, force strength, and battle plan. Which is to say, the Hebrews the narrator will tell us later, had sided with the Philistines, but then come back to the Israelites. So when the Philistines first came, some Israelites left, and they are referred to as Hebrews. As noted, Sternberg in a previous video highlights there are three different groups here. There are the Israelites who are with Saul, there are the Hebrews who are now with the Philistines, and then there are the Philistines themselves. So Jonathan said, we will cross over, and this is a little wordplay here on Hebrewing. As you can see here, this echoing into what the Philistines' response is in verse 11. They both use the little word hine, which is behold, and this wordplay where Jonathan says to cross over Avrim, and the Philistines say Hebrews Ivrim. And of course, Hebrew means basically crossers over. So we'll act like Hebrews here. We'll cross over to them and show ourselves, literally uncover ourselves or expose ourselves to them, which is to say come out from behind the rocks. And then this pairing of possibilities that Jonathan is determines whether Yahweh's on their side or not. So then it plays out here, and Fackelman notes below in these verses, the execution matches the plan with exceptions added by the narrator for emphasis. For example, and the Philistines said, indicating their sense of superiority. So let's get the rest of our scene on the screen here. If I can get all of it, probably can't get all of it, and let's see how the aftermath unfolds. So we're now looking at this outcome here, 11 to 15. So both of them showed themselves of garrison to the Philistines, and the Philistines said, as I just said, behold, Hebrews, coming out of the holes where they have hidden themselves. That's possibly a denigrating word to think that these Hebrews are like animals, like rats or other animals that hide in holes, and that wouldn't surprise us at all. But here they come, and presumably the Philistines think like easy targets. We can just take them on. But strangely, that's not what happens. So they hail them. The men of the garrison hail, literally simply answered, Jonathan's armor bearer, come up to us and we will show you something. It's a little ambiguous in the Hebrew here. The word we will show can mean to make known, and the whole phrase here can be translated as Net Bible, a New English translation has, so we can teach you a thing or two, or some translations say we will teach you a lesson. So whether it's a negative thing like we'll show you, you young whippersnapper, we'll teach you a lesson, or whether it's more open-ended, hey, come on up and we'll show you something, it's ambiguous there. So Jonathan takes that, though, as the Yahweh sign and says, come after me, for Yahweh has given them into the hand of Israel, acting on behalf of Israel, not on behalf of his father Saul or on his own behalf, but on behalf of Israel. So now we see how the battle, so to speak, unfolds. Jonathan climbing up on his hands and feet, highlighting they're in this mountainous region, with his assistant following him, and out of nowhere the Philistines fell before Jonathan. As Fackelman notes, we could equally well translate, they threw themselves down before Jonathan. Or as he says just a little later, given 12d here, acquires the literary connotation, they fell in the dust before Yahweh the deliverer. So there seems to be no battle, no explanation for why the Philistines, seeing these two people suddenly fall down, and they kill them. And the narrator adds in this first slaughter, Makkah here, Jonathan and his assistant killed about 20 men, with this odd detail of this particular area. The phrase for half a furrow here is used only one other time in the Masoretic text, and this phrase acre of land is an odd phrase, really like a pair of fields or something, as the Brown Driver Briggs lexicon notes that the phrase is the only word in Hebrew for a square measure of land. But it's to say it's in a tight space. Half a furrow long, so to speak, is this tiny space, so they strategically forced the Philistines to meet them in this narrow space in the mountains, and that gave them the power to take them on. But then the aftermath is really strange, because apart from what happens up there in the mountain pass, there's a panic in the camp and the field among all the people, the garrison, and even the raiders tremble, the earthquake, and it became a very great panic. They're completely overwhelmed. These mighty Philistines, who just in a couple of chapters will have their champion Goliath stand there and taunt young David and act like they're in control. Suddenly you're in a panic. Let's look a little more closely at this last verse before we stop. Panic twice here. Haradu matches with trembled here, Harad. So there's some wordplay going on there. Notice how ubiquitous it is. It starts in the camp, and as Sumera notes, a merismatic expression in the camp as well as in the battlefield, referring to the entire unit, and among all the people. The word for raiders can be read elsewhere. Literally, it's a participle meaning the ones ruining, or those who destroy, so it could be the destroyers as opposed to the raiders. Trembled here, again, I just noted the wordplay, and the earth quaked, whether that's meant to be Yahweh's action, as Falcoman notes, or meant that all the panic is causing the earth to quake. And then it ends with a strange wordplay. The ORSV here has it became a very great panic, but the word for great is Elohim. And certainly in Genesis 1:1 and 2, we can hear Elohim used that way, whether it's Yahweh Elohim as the Lord God, or Elohim as a mighty wind, mighty spirit on the land, over the water rather, before it separates into land. Elohim can be an adjective of intensification, as no RSV has here. But the New English makes it much more specific. This fear was caused by God, and translations are evenly divided. Some have a fear brought on by God, or something like that. So it's ambiguous of whether the narrator is affirming Jonathan's view here that Yahweh is directly involved in it. But if it isn't for that translation issue, we don't know. Do we take Jonathan at his word that correlation is causation here, or is it not? We'll have to wait to find out. But in the next scene, we'll see Saul responding in a way that really highlights the difference in character between the Father and the Son, and we'll pick that up next time. See you then.